So every last week of the month will be on forensic psychiatry. So today Dr. Naveen will be discussing about this issue of how we are going to do workup in forensic psychiatry. Basic we are starting. And whenever we do classes, we do attempt to share the write-up about the whole seminar or whatever the symposium. Today's class, Dr. Naveen, what he is doing, we will be sharing you some of the material to read also, so that you have the presentation also, and also the write-up regarding the how to do workup. Similarly, the next class will be on most probably on insanity defense. So we will be again sharing the articles and also some of the materials for reading, and also the presentation will be sharing. This is about the forensic psychiatry. We will have around 12 classes for a period of next month. And also at the same time, there will be geriatric psychiatry specialty, child psychiatry, and also the rehab and brain simulation. That is by Professor Jagdisha will be taking up. And this whole initiative is a collaboration between South Zone, IPS, NIMHANS, and the whole this program is sponsored by, basically funded by Linex Pharmaceuticals Chennai. So now over to Dr. Naveen.
Before that, I request Dr. Mahesh Gowda to kindly speak a few words.
I think this is the most welcome initiative. We were waiting for this PG program to start off, and I think we are on time. I think we should go ahead. All the best for the program.
Thank you, Dr. BMS and Dr. Mahesh Gowda, sir. It would be great if Dr. Jagdish, who is also president of IPS South Zone, if he were to be available. For various reasons, he is not available right now. We'll see if we can get him by the end of this class. Over to Dr. Naveen, sir.
So, thank you, Suresh sir and Dr. Mahesh and the IPS and the Linex for coming up with a very good and great initiative. Today, I'm going to briefly talk about two important issues, basic, I would say, to any person who works in forensic psychiatry. I know there are other basic needs in forensic psychiatry. For example, after the new Mental Health Care Act has come, residents would like to know about admission and discharge procedures and various provisions that are there in the Mental Health Care Act. But from a forensic perspective, I think definitely we will be engaging you people with all these classes, like admission and discharge procedures is one of the very, very basic things. Maybe in the next few classes only we will address that in the forensic module. However, today I'm going to talk about the workup pro forma. The forensic pro forma is a little different one. Of course, doing workups are part and parcel of every psychiatric resident as a psychiatry training, but forensic workup is little different in the sense that a lot more details are to be taken. So we'll see what it is, and related aspects of forensic workup is about fitness to stand trial. Of course, it's also related to insanity defense, but as Professor Suresh mentioned, the issue of insanity defense is going to be handled in the next in the upcoming sessions. So in today's class, I'll be covering the forensic workup, how to do a forensic workup, what all details to be taken, and I'll also talk a few things about fitness to stand trial. I'm sure there will be many doubts and queries and clarifications. For that, there are options. Chetan, would you like to make an announcement about their clarifications? What is the way in which they could clarify? What is the way in which they could raise their queries?
While classes are going on, or even after the class during the question and answer session, I request you all to kindly raise your hands. The option is available on your screen. So after you raise your hands, we'll see your, or you can chat with us directly. And once you chat or raise your hands and put up in the chat, we'll take up those questions.
So I just thought we'll share, I'll start with this case scenario, which I'm sure many of you would have encountered. So Mr. X, a 51-year-old person, is brought to your OPD from Central Prison accompanying letter reports abnormal behavior, the court is requesting for your expert opinion. So what would be the next step? This is how a usual clinical scenario starts. Now, before giving the expert opinion, there are many things that need to be done. Now, that is the substance of the forensic workup. So, what all details should be taken, should be collected as part of the forensic workup. Of course, many things are in common with the clinical workup, like for example, the detailed demographic details, the place of examination, the time of examination, who is the accompanying person, if at all, if the person is sent from the prison, there are accompanying police people, and you should also mention, of course, this is there in the clinical workup also, whether what information you get is reliable and adequate or not. One thing to keep in mind for persons coming from the prisons, the information provided will either be unreliable or inadequate, because the patient will be the sole person who can talk about the illness, but depending on the illness and many other factors, there will be nobody else to give you the history. For example, the patient is being brought by a person who is not usually in charge of the particular person in the prison. So it will be awfully inadequate, and sometimes, many a times unreliable history also. So these things need to be kept in mind. And very, very important, identification marks. So, these things tend to get missed out in the routine clinical workup. It should not be there at that time. Also, it should be looked upon. It should be marked very meticulously. But even more so in forensic cases, because most of the times, we will be called to the court, and identification marks are a very, very vital cog in the wheel. So I was just talking about noting down whether the information is reliable, whether it's adequate and inadequate. These things are extremely crucial, because whatever has been written in the file will have to stand the scrutiny of both examination in chief as well as cross-examination in the court of law. So one needs to be extremely careful and think twice before documenting in the file. Of course, forensic workup will take much more time when compared to the normal clinical workup, but you have no other choice, because courts will call you maybe after 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and then you would have forgotten what case you have seen and who is this person. But at that time, the only thing which you can rely upon is what has been written in the file. Many times you will not be there. Some other one of your friends or your students will be called to the court, because that person will be on duty. So it's extremely crucial to mention these things truthfully in the file. So that's about information, that's about identification marks. And next important thing in a forensic workup is to talk about the referring authority. Usually forensic cases, particularly cases from the prison, they have 1 or 2 accompanying letters. It's extremely crucial to take some time to read what is written in those accompanying letters and who is the referring authority. Because as I've told you earlier, the patient will be the sole person who knows about, who can talk about his illness. But depending on various clinical factors, he or she may or may not be in a position to give proper history or to cooperate for the exam. So it's important to know who is the referring authority, whether it's the chief medical officer of the prison, or is it the superintendent of the prison, or is it the court itself is asking you directly to examine. So the referring authority, would have referred that particular patient for a particular reason. So these things are extremely crucial, and we are going to share, as Dr. Suresh was mentioning, we are going to share the forensic proforma that we are using here. So all these details are there. It's just a I am trying to just summarize what all details we have given in the proforma. So that proforma, I think, will be shared, and you all can start using it. So these things are extremely crucial. I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about the reason for referral that needs to be ascertained very, very clearly. Like for forensic cases, the reason for referral would be mentioned, clearly. Like for example, the reason is treatment of that particular patient, or is it a certificate on his or her insanity, or certificate for fitness to stand trial, which I'm going to talk about after completing the workup details. Then certificate for understanding capacity, for fitness for duties, handling the firearms, fitness for writing the will, etc., etc. So this is particularly crucial. Now, if we miss this particular point and we just concentrate on the clinical issues, the purpose for which the referral was done will not get served at all. So it's crucial for us to note down these things, and while giving back the certificate, it is very, very important to answer the specific queries that has been asked by the referring authority. So the other important aspect of a forensic workup is to make a note on the legal and conflict. Like for example, it is if the cases come from the prison, whether the patient is an under trial prisoner or he or she has already been convicted, that makes a huge difference. Whether the person is on bail or not, the work related conflicts are there or not. Has the person come for availing medical leave? Are there any family matters? Are there any property matters? Any other conflicts, legal related issues that the person has got entangled into? So these kind of things we need to make a note in the file. Yeah. So coming to the next point, particularly for persons who have come from the prison, we need to talk about what charges has been framed, upon the patient. The charges against the client, and information regarding the conflict with law. So it is better. Usually these details will be there in the referral letter. These things would be there. So one needs to note these things. It is always better to include IPC sections, the Indian sections of the Indian Penal Code. And also important to know if a patient is from prison. Of course, it is from the prison, or any crime accusations are there or not. The other important point to note is many times the prisons send what is known as the behavioral observation report. Now I've already told you. It is extremely. The history provided is likely to be very unreliable or inadequate. So sometimes these behavioral observation reports do give us a very, very crucial information. The observed behavior by the authorities there, that sometimes will be very, very crucial to come to a conclusion. So if the behavioral observation report is not already sent, it is vital or important to ask for the behavioral observation report from our side. So that is about it. Then, of course, the other details, other legal details are needs to know the duration of the stay in prison, and then in the referring letter, there will always be the complaints as per the referring authority. So that has to be noted. Then you come to the chief complaints as per the patient. So many a times there is a discrepancy between the complaints given by the referring authority and the complaints given by the patient. So it's all important to know whether these two sync with each other, or those are different, because the connotations are different, and all these things will help you in coming to a conclusion at the end of the workup or at the end of the assessment, the work. And coming to the history of, so after all these details, next comes the history of presenting illness. Now, of course, the HOPI is not much different from the routine HOPI. However, one needs to concentrate on certain specific things, and one such thing is to know as many details as possible around the circumstances of the crime. I mean, of course, it's not possible 100% of the time to get to know the circumstances around the alleged crime for all cases, but then an effort has to be made, and that effort has to be noted in the file, because if the person is not grossly psychotic, the person may or may not be able to give some details. So those details, as per the patient's report, those will have to be noted inside the file. That's a crucial thing. So after that, I mean, you get the details of the present history, and of course the circumstances around the crime should be mentioned somewhere there. And then the other parts of the history are simple, like past history. In the past history, we would be interested to know the psychiatric past history, the medical past history, whatever is there, whatever you are able to get. Then the treatment history, I don't have to go into the details of the treatment history. You all know when was it treated, how many episodes of treatment, what drugs were given, what were the side effects, were there any response or no, whatever is possible, you should take and note it down in the file. If it is not possible, you please write it in the file that these details could not be elicited. And of course, to always specify the source of information, like as per the informant, as per the patient or patient himself or herself. The family history, we generally draw a 3-generation pedigree charting with names of each family members, age, occupation, etc. From the forensic point of view, I am just writing this. Of course, from a clinical point of view, there are many other details that need to be mentioned in the family history. But from a forensic point of view, this is what is important. Next, going on to the personal history, you all know what all details need to be taken. The premorbid personality, and the next coming to the general physical examination, the mental status evaluation, all the details you would know. Of course, the cognitive functions are important, and then come to the plan of management. Of course, the plan of management may include investigations, ward observations. First of all, outpatient thing is necessary, outpatient thing is sufficient, or the person will have to be admitted. That is one decision that need to be taken. That depends on both the clinical necessity as well as the administrative necessity. You may not feel the clinical need, but if the court has asked for assessing fitness, then it is always risky to base our judgment on one outpatient evaluation. So we generally ask the person to get admitted, so that repeated evaluations over a period of time, we can assess him or her repeatedly, and then come to our conclusion based on the judgment of based on our judgment of 1 or 2 months. So this plan has to be made, and seeing the person daily will increase our confidence in our opinions about the person's fitness. And of course, the diagnosis. Now, diagnosis in forensic, Dr. Suresh always keeps telling that that there is no need for us to immediately label a person to have a psychiatric diagnosis. Now, that is because a couple of other issues I would like to mention here when doing a forensic workup. Now, the forensic workup is a different kind of entity from a clinical when compared to the clinical workup. The reason is, in clinical workups, the clinician is always thought to be helping towards the patient's problems. Now, in forensic psychiatry, what happens if a forensic assessment is being done, the attitude of the helping attitude of the clinician, sometimes should take a backseat, simply because the patient may not have come on his or her own, but being referred by some other statutory authorities to help the statutory authority and not the patient per se. Now, if the referring authority says it is for treatment purpose, that's a different issue. But even then, the treating clinician will have the dual obligation. One is to help the patient clinically, and the other one is to help the law enforcing authorities or the judiciary. Now, these two will get into conflict often. Now, at that time, it's very, very important for the clinician to maintain that kind of sanity to, detach himself or herself from being able to help the patient, So, like, for example, you take the issue of confidentiality. Now, the confidentiality clause is there. You are bound to not disclose, some confidential information to somebody based on whatever law is there. That's a different issue. When it comes to the core forensic workup, there's no question of maintaining the confidentiality because the court will ask and you will have to give. So that clause may not work here. So what I want to say, the forensic workups are that's which is why in Western other developed countries, the treating clinician will be different, while the forensic psychiatrist or the forensic evaluation will be different, and the forensic psychiatrist will have no obligation to treat the patient for his clinical problems. So these kind of things we need to, but of course in India we don't have the luxury to have a different clinicians for clinical purpose, a different clinician for forensic purpose, but somehow we will have to develop that kind of an attitude wherein some kind of detachment will have to be developed by the treating clinicians while they do the forensic workup. And coming to and of course, NIMHANS has started the forensic psychiatry unit, and we would be happy to take up referrals and do independent forensic evaluations particularly. So the referrals can be sent here, and with a particular viewpoint of a forensic evaluation, we would be happy to carry out, and other programs are being rolled out in the forensic psychiatry unit of the department. Like, for example, the DM course and all are all on their anvil, and we would be starting it sometime next year. So, so that's about maintaining detachment. And of course, there is no hurry. Since forensic workup is different from a clinical workup, there is no hurry for any person to jump into a conclusion and to make a diagnosis. If a clinical need is there, of course, that takes precedence, but majority of the time, these clinical needs will be taken care by the local person. So we can as well wait. We can observe the person. You can see what is the exact purpose for the patient getting admitted. And then, based on repeated observations, the diagnosis generally in our ward, what we do is the diagnosis will be done at the last moment. So because once we commit to something, that will stand even after 4 years, 5 years, 10 years. So you will have to have sufficient information and sufficient justification for you to come to the diagnosis, because that diagnosis will be questioned by the opposite lawyer. So you will have to come up with enough justifications to support your diagnosis. So, and of course, clinical needs are different. Clinical for starting the treatment, say for example, to start ECT, there is no tearing hurry for you to make a diagnosis of severe depression. There are many symptomatic indicators for ECT. So if ECT is required, you please start ECT. If you find a psychotic symptom, you can start the person on antipsychotics. So managing those clinical needs should be different from forensic evaluation. So please don't tie up both of them. Of course, they both go hand in hand, but one has to maintain the detachment. Next slide, please. So coming to the next aspect, you will have to request for more information, because for a forensic evaluation to get completed, you will have to have all information at your disposal. Like for example, if a person comes from the prison, what is the first information report? Because you would have listened to a person, his or her version of the story. For example, I was talking about the circumstances around the alleged crime. He would tell his version of the story, but the FIR may be different. So we can actually talk to or write a letter to the concerned police station to send the FIR. And sometimes by the time patient comes to us, charges also would have been framed, and sometimes the police or the jail would be able to give the charge sheet details also. So charge sheet, of course, will contain the details of everything. First information report is a very brief thing given by the police. Charge sheet also sometimes the charge sheet is nothing but a detailed framing of all the complaints according to the IPC. The charge sheet is the document upon which the trial will be starting. And many times we would want to see the autopsy or the postmortem report from the police station. Then letters will have to be returned to the court or prison or police station to get any of these things. And calling family members, many a times we have observed that family members are somewhere there, and once through the police station, if we are able to contact the family and ask them to come, many a times they come, and then they would give the relevant details regarding the crime as well as the clinical status of the patient. Many a times that will help us to solve many of the legal puzzles. And of course, please consider referring to the legal aid clinic. Of course, this pertains to the civil liabilities and not the criminal liabilities, because criminal liabilities patients will already be in the prison and they would already be undergoing the trial. So after collecting, this information, I just want to briefly tell that asking a copy of the FIR and charge sheet, interviewing the patient repeatedly again and again to get more and more information, calling family members, past history of treatment details of crime, the behavioral observation report from this thing, and witness interview if required, nursing staff report, that is the behavioral observation report inside our wards, and serial MSCs. All these things will give us more and more information, and after which we can confidently come to something. Now, there are some skills to be inculcated. Now, for example, when you ask the circumstances around the crime, there are certain questions like what are the charges that are framed against you, or tell me about the circumstance one day prior to the incident, and then you can start from there and keep asking, so what happened next on the particular day, what happened on the particular moment, what happened soon after the incident, what did you do, how what things got unveiled. So how did you land up in the jail, what are the circumstances that led you to go into the jail, who started complaining, who was the first person who came in contact. So these kind of questions will help you get a clear picture of the circumstance of the crime also. Ask reflecting or reframing questions from the victim's point of view, like how did he or she feel, what were the thoughts that were running in that person's mind during that time, and was there any pain, or what kind of behavior he demonstrated during that time. So some of these questions will help you get more and more details of the circumstances around the crime. So ward observation is another important thing, like how much assistance the person requires in performing the personal care, for grooming, dressing, participating in ward activities. The nurses can be invaluable in giving us this information, because they stay with the patient for throughout the day, and then they are very well versed with these things. So information from them will be very, very valid. How is the social functioning in the ward? Does he mix with other patients inside the ward? How is his communication pattern with the ward patients or other staff members of the ward? How is the biological functioning? Like, for example, food intake. How is the food intake? The bowel and bladder habits, are they normal, abnormal? How is the compliance to the medication intake? Does it have to be forced, or he or she comes and takes it very usually? Any abnormal behaviors that are noticed? Any contradictory behavior? Like, for example, if a doctor goes and chats with him, the person doesn't speak. But once the doctor is away, his speech with the inmates becomes normal. So this kind of contradictory things, are they being noticed or not? Repeated mental status evaluations, and of course the cognitive functions. So I think before going to the next thing, we would take up. So there are some questions that are come. First one is I don't know who has asked
Mahesh.
it. Dr. Mahesh, what is the minimum period of observation before certification? No, I think there is no hard and fast rule key. These many days of observation is required. It depends on the confidence and how comfortable are the treating clinicians before the certificates can be given. In our institute, for example, if a person does not have any clinical issues, even then, like for example, if the fitness for handling firearms, we get many referrals from the forces like this, and even if there is no illness, we tend to admit the patient for about a week or even 2 weeks just to see just to be confident with ourselves to make sure that things are things are normal, and then we would be confident enough to give the certificate. The other thing which I would the other thing that we are practicing here is that in such kind of fitness related things, it's always better to consult a colleague. For example, it could be a medical board, or it could be 2-3 people in the forensic team itself. So to deliberate upon the case and then come to a consensus, and then all of them issuing the certificates. For example, in medical board, the chairperson will be there, the treating clinician will be there, and some other independent clinician also will be there. So in that sense, the responsibility will be diluted. Not only that, the authenticity of the certificate will be much more, as opposed to one clinician signing. Of course, it is not written anywhere that one person should not sign, but for safeguarding our own interests, and of course to get valuable help from our colleagues, it's always better to have a team of people assessing it from a forensic point of view before giving certificate. Yes. Is assessment of capacity and relevance how frequent? Of course, the assessment of capacity now, after the Mental Health Care Act has come, day in and day out, we'll have to do the capacity assessment, and I think capacity assessment will deserve a separate class in itself. What are the guidelines and how frequently it has to be done? For voluntary, it is different. So I think we'll take it up in some other session, because it will take a long time.
Do we comment of mental status and crime association or other questions related?
See, these comments, I would not commit on to anything. It all depends on what is the question asked. So it is always better from the legal point of view to stick to the questions, whatever they have asked. If we stick to, so we can make our independent opinions, we can deliberate and discuss in our team, but while communicating it to the court, it is always better to stick to what question they have asked. Unnecessarily bringing in technical jargons will not be of any help. That is what I have experienced. If the fitness is there, you should say he is fit enough to stand trial. Or if you feel the fitness is not, it is not there, then you'll have to say, because of these reasons, fitness is not there at this point in time.
The need to diagnostic assessments or IQ assessments?
Yes, and of course, if those things are there, we will have to definitely ask for them. And even if a slightest doubt is there, we would prefer that all these assessments need to be done. That is because somebody may question, or your own doubts are there. So instead of moving on with these doubts, it's always better to ask your colleague to come up with psychometric assessments or IQ assessments. Or some clinicians are very confident; they don't want these particularly the psychometric assessments I'm talking about. IQ though, if the suspicion is there, it definitely will ask for it. But some clinicians may not be may not want the psychometrics to be done, but that depends on the individual clinician. There's no hard and fast rule key you have to take, but if you feel that psychometry will help you in arriving at a diagnosis or ruling out a certain possibility, yes, why not? But of course, whoever has taken these things, they will be called to the court and they'll have to be responsible to answer that. Anything else is there?
Awesome.
Yeah, I think so. So I think we'll move on to the next because all the questions are have been covered. Next couple of minutes, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, I'll be talking about the fitness to stand trial. So again, we'll start with a clinical scenario. Again, Mr. X is brought to your OPD from Central Prison. Accompanying letter request for fitness to stand trial. How to assess for fitness to stand trial? Now, this fitness to stand trial, everybody, I'd like to drag the attention of all residents and other participants to IPC section 84, which states that, which actually is in vogue in our country, which states that nothing is an offense which is done by a person who at the time of doing it, by reason of unsoundness of mind, is incapable of knowing the nature of the act, or that he is doing what is either wrong or contrary to the law. Now, the assumption here is everyone should know the law. The ignorance, you can't plead ignorance before the law. You can't say that, you can't use that as a defense. And everyone is sane until proven the contrary. And you work from normal towards illness by collecting evidences. So these are some of the assumptions that are required. Now, insanity defense, of course, Professor Suresh mentioned that it will be dealt with in another class, because I thought we'll talk about this here also, as there is some relevance to fitness to stand trial. Before the trial start, you will have to see whether the person is fit or not. Otherwise, like for example, a person with moderate MR he's being charged with a murder. There's no point, if the fitness is not proved in front of the court, there's no point in continuing the trial, starting the trial at all. Now, there is this concept of medical insanity versus legal insanity. I'll just tell a couple of words and then stop at that stage and then move on to the fitness. Now, medical insanity is nothing but, and the courts are always bothered about legal insanity and not medical insanity. That one point we'll have to make it clear. Now, what is medical insanity? What is legal insanity? Now, medical insanity is nothing but the diagnosis that we make, whether it's adjustment disorder or a PTSD or a schizophrenia or whatever. On the contrary, legal insanity, loss of reasoning is at the core of legal insanity. Not only that, at the time of committing the crime. Now, loss of reasoning at the time of committing the crime, that has to be proved. And, these things can occur in any of the diagnosis. Or in other words, the court is not bothered about whether the person is, suffering from schizophrenia or suffering from bipolar disorder or whatever. That's, the court is not at all bothered about that. What the court wants to know is that whether the loss of reasoning was there at the time of committing the crime, and this loss of reasoning has led him to blah, 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 those things. So, these two differentiating factors one needs to be aware while talking about insanity defense. Now, the requirement to be fulfilled for 84 IPC, one is, of course, the medical insanity should be there. That is, the mental, some form of mental illness should be there at the during the commission of the crime. The criteria 2 also should be met. That is, loss of reasoning power. How do you assess that? One has to prove that the patient does not know the nature of the act, or that he is doing what is either wrong or contrary to the law. So all these points need to be met, for taking this particular defense. Now, next.
This one, sir.
Next. Yeah. So, previous insanity is already proved. Certain conditions, considerations will have to be borne. That is, whether there was deliberation and preparation for the act, whether it was done in a manner which showed a desire to concealment, and whether after the crime the offender showed consciousness of guilt and made efforts to avoid detection. So that's why getting to know the circumstances around the alleged crime is very, very crucial. So to assess the insanity, there is a lot of confusion. Yeah. So whether after the crime the offender showed consciousness of guilt and made efforts to avoid detections, and etc. etc. So in cases where insanity has to be proved, the accused needs to prove that he has mental illness and he was suffering from mental illness during the commission of the crime. Next one. So the other few points which has been noted by the court, that every person who is suffering from mental disease is not ipso facto, that is not automatically exempted from criminal liability. That one has to keep in mind. And the court has made the distinction between medical and legal insanity that I have already told. And though presence of mental illness is a must, it does not guarantee applicability of Section 84. Of course, the legal insanity is at the core. So though the burden of accused, though the burden is on accused to prove, he is not required to prove the same beyond all reasonable doubt, but merely satisfy the preponderance of probability. Next. So sorry. So the loss of reasoning power, some of these points are important to know whether the reasoning power is lost or not. Like, for example, whether there was a deliberation and preparation for the act, whether it was done in a manner which showed a desire for concealment and disposing evidences in which the crime was committed, motivation for the crime, presence of accomplices, involving in a complex task during the commitment of the crime, whether after the crime the offender showed consciousness of guilt and made efforts to avoid detections, whether after his arrest he or she offered false excuses and made false statements. So planning, desire for concealment, and his or her conduct to avoid detection of the crime, all these things will go a long way to say whether the person. Next. So I think I'll skip this slide. So coming to the core assessment of fitness. Fitness to stand trial. In India, there are no standardized scales as of now to assess fitness to stand trial. But when you review many scales that are used in the Western countries, of course, most of them are applicable to our country as well. These are some of the domains that are very, very essential and crucial for us to assess before giving whether the person is fit enough or not to stand the trial. One is, of course, cognitive functions. Some of the questions to that is a very simple one. Is he or she oriented to time, place, or person? Is he or she able to count 20 to 1 backwards or weekdays, forwards and backwards? These simple tests will tell you whether the general cognition is okay or not okay. Next domain in fitness to stand trial is the ability to understand the charges against the patient. Now, some of the questions can be, what are the charges framed against you? So whether the patient is in a position to tell them clearly or not. What are the possible penalties if the charges are proven? What is bail and who grants it? Now, what do you understand by the term judgment? What do you mean by appeal? What could be your sentence? So these are some of the things which will help us to know whether the person is in a position to understand the charges or not. Next important aspect of this fitness to stand trial is understanding the court proceedings. Now, court proceedings means what all things happen during the trial, and of course related to his or her legal rights. Like, are you aware of your legal rights? Now, questions like, who is the chief of the court? Who has the authority to release you from the prison? Who will fight your case? What is the role of your lawyer in the court? That is a defense counsel. What is the role of a prosecution lawyer? So that is yeah. So after that, the next dimension comes is the helping the attorney or the lawyer. Sorry. So what is a lawyer's name? What will you do if you are unable to hire the services of a lawyer? How will you help your lawyer to defend your case? Do you trust your lawyer? So some of these questions will help the attorney or to understand this particular dimension. The next dimension is to test what is the behavior in the court. What are the answers to this particular question? Now, some of the questions include, what must you do when the magistrate enters the court? How will you address the magistrate? What should you do before answering the questions in the court of law? What must you do if opposite lawyer asks you a question for which you don't know the answer? What must you do if opposite lawyer asks certain provoking questions? Do you know the consequences of inappropriate behavior like shouting, violence, aggression in the court? So these are not hard and fast questions, but these definitely will help us to know whether the person is fit enough to stand trial or not. Yes. Now, I've talked about the reasonings and the dimensions of assessing fitness to stand trial. Of course, the fitness to go and do duty, rejoin duty, that is different. Fitness to handle firearms, that we don't even know. It's a very, very new area in our country, but definitely these things will come more and more, and we will be called upon to assess these things. But these general items can be modified to suit the specific tasks at hand, but now these some of these dimensions I've spoke about, but there are some criticisms for this as well. Of course, we will, for academic, from an academic standpoint, we'll have this discussion, but then those dimensions are there across the globe, and I think we will be served better if we start using these dimensions. Now, people say that these are highly cognition based and reasoning based. They are categorical in nature. There's no bearing on the affect or emotion, no bearing on perception, and the burden of proof is on the person with mental illness. That means to say that if a person with mental illness is there, then the insanity defense has to be proved by him or her, and proving that he had a mental illness and because of that he lost reasoning power and he committed the crime is difficult proposition to prove. All this for academic discussions. So, fitness to stand trial and insanity, they both are related concept. Once he's fit only, then he will be proven whether medical insanity is there or not. So I'll go back to the same picture again. I think I'll stop at this stage. I know it's a bit abrupt, but then I like to say that fitness to stand trial will incorporate these 4 dimensions that I talked about, and then based on these things we can comment whether fitness has to be given or not. So I think I'll stop at this stage. Brief talk on working up the forensic cases as well as on fitness to stand trial. And coming to the question is, if somebody wants to make a will and in the past had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, now maintaining well, what extra assessment we have to do in these patients? Yeah, I think like we talked about fitness to stand trial, testamentary capacity is another kind of a fitness. And what I'd like to say is that just because a person has had schizophrenia in the past, nothing stops him or her from making a valid will at this point in time. But testamentary capacity, as different from the fitness to stand trial, also has these dimensions like cognitive functions, whether he is able to understand what is the property and whom does he want to give, why does he want to give, what will happen to the property once he writes the will. So some of these dimensions are there. I am sure a separate a class or a discussion is there on assessing testamentary capacity as well. So I would not like to go into the details of that, but the basic dimensions are the same for even testamentary capacity. And of course, person with schizophrenia, if the testamentary capacity is intact, can make a valid will. There is no problem there. There is one question regarding scales to be used. In India, I think till now, there is no simple validated scale to assess fitness. That is what is my first point. But at the same time, we are in the midst of something. We are in the midst of developing something in our institute, and these questions are taken from them as well. So it will take some more time for us to come up with the scale, and our aim is to come up with one which can be used easily, across the country. But nothing stops you people from using these questions, and based on that you could make your clinical impressions. But I am afraid I should say that there are no validated scale to assess fitness to stand trial as of now in India.
Dr. BMS. Yes, sir.
Yeah. See, one more thing is, when you are doing the assessment, especially regarding the referral from prison, if you have never, you are seeing first time in the OPD, please do consider for admission. The reason being is ward observation is essential, serial MSc is essential, cognitive functioning is essential. So at least for a period of 1 to 2 weeks, observation is essential. no sir, the person is a very old case of schizophrenia and he has now got into conflict with law and he has come now and you have already have a good records, no need to worry, you can issue the certificate on OPD basis only. But the first time the patient has come from the prison, please don't issue any certificate on OPD basis. Please admit and then observe and then you issue the certificate. So I would request admission is one, and don't hurry up the diagnosis, because what happens is we have seen many a times the patient has come to the OPD, the junior resident or somebody sees and makes one diagnosis, senior resident makes another diagnosis, and when we are discharging after admission, you make a third diagnosis. So there are 3 different diagnoses for the same patient, which is unwanted, unwarranted. When the file goes to the court, they will ask these questions. Best thing would be admit or keep the diagnosis, provisional diagnosis. Final diagnosis should be done when the certificate is issued. So keep all differential diagnosis. The reason being is a person is, as the law says, is any person is sane until proven. To get the proven, you have to collect the evidence. To collect the evidences, you have to keep admit for a period of 2 weeks, have serial MSc, get the information, collateral information, all those things, and then you have to do the assessment. And another important thing in workup is collecting the collateral information, getting the FIR, getting the information from the family members, charge sheet, and if possible, doing the home visit or a social worker going to the workplace where the person was working. That will give you a valid information. And if possible, if the patient has been arrested for 302, getting the post-mortem report will get you the information how the crime was committed. At also the same time, if possible, if you get an opportunity to investigate or interview the IO, that is investigating officer, that also will add more information to the case, and getting all these information will help you in synthesizing your formulation when you are issuing the certificate.
Is there any uniform format for issuing certificate? Any format is there?
May we know who is asking the question?
Sir, I am Dr. Dusadram speaking from Mysore. I just wanted to know what is the format of issuing certificate. Is there any particular format, universal kind of thing?
Yeah, there is a APA, American Psychiatric Association. There is a format what we use everywhere. But if especially in India, we would like to stick to the point, telling that the person is having mental illness, full stop. That's the best, or he doesn't have mental illness. The rest of the thing is testified in the court of law, remaining things. But in APA, if you look at the American Forensic Psychiatry Association, they write a report of around 3 pages or almost 2.5 pages report telling that on what basis he had come, what are the family background, the circumstances of the alleged crime, where it has been done, how it was done. And finally, they even go ahead and report telling that the person was suffering from mental illness and loss of reasoning is the reason who has committed the crime. I don't think our law should go, as we being the expert, we should not go to that extent issuing the certificate. Our issuing certificate should be very specific. Dr. Naveen, would you like to add?
Yeah, I think I agree with you, because the court particularly is bothered about 1 or 2 aspects of our certification. So they are not bothered about anything else. And the more details we give, the more feeding we do for the opposite lawyer. So it is better to be specific and to the point. If the patient, the court has asked you for fitness, it say that if fitness is there or not there, that's it. And patient, now we have a case where the court is asked whether the understanding capacity is there or not. We will have to stick to that. Dr. Suresh wants to add some more things.
The couple of questions are also coming from WhatsApp. One of the question what they say is who can give the fitness. The clinician who has done the assessment should give the fitness certificate. It is not the person who is not assessed should not give. It is the psychiatrist who has done the assessment should issue the certificate. A. B. The second question is how to do an assessment for fitness or a mental capacity for a juvenile who is in conflict with the law. That there is a special class taken by our child psychiatry team. Definitely we will address this issue in the forthcoming classes regarding in the child psychiatry segment. For reminding you to all, there will be classes every last week of the month will be forensic psychiatry, child psychiatry classes we have decided, we'll let you know, geriatric psychiatry classes, and brain stimulation and rehab classes will be taken. So there are 2 or every week there will be a classes, And I request everyone, whoever is coming online, please mute your mic because it causes disturbances for the presentation.
Dr. Birva Desai, can you please ask your question? We are going to unmute you now.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah.
Sir, how do we assess the mental capacity as per the Mental Healthcare Act 2017, and how do we correlate it with the medical insanity and the legal insanity?
Yeah, I'll answer, sir. Then you can take up, sir. Yeah. So as per the Mental Health Care Act, see, there is this guidance document that has come, which has given directions as to how to assess mental capacity. I think you all must have received it by now. It's a simple one-page document that has come up, so that has to be used. And again, while talking about medical insanity and legal insanity, those two are different things. Medical insanity is about what diagnosis you make, and the issue of capacity in Mental Health Care Act is restricted to capacity to take mental health care treatment, mental health care and treatment decisions. Now, legal insanity is a totally different concept, which is applicable only in cases of crime, and if the patient wants to use that as a defense to get acquitted from that crime. As I have told in the previous presentation, legal insanity is associated, it's not associated with the diagnosis, it is associated with the loss of reasoning which could have been present at the time of committing the crime. So anything else to be added, sir? Dr. Suresh?
Yeah, see, one more thing is we are now entering into too many domains of capacity assessment. The Mental Health Care Act is very specifically for capacity assessment for admission, treatment, and any other intervention to be done. Capacity assessment for the capacity to make a valid will is separate. We'll have a separate class for that. And one of the question which has come here is, should we medicalize all the cases, all criminal cases? We will not medicalize all cases. There is very clearly, we will discuss about insanity defense. There is a separate class on insanity defense, and we will share the slides on insanity defense, how to do the assessment, and how we will go with the medical insanity, and how the court will consider the legal insanity depending upon various Supreme Court judgments. That also will be shared along with you. Basically, we are trying to help the court whether the person was fits for IPC section 84, that is insanity defense. That is basically we are helping the court. We are not going to take any judgment. Either we are going to say medicalize it or we are going to legalize it. No, it is basically we'll say he has mental illness. Because of mental illness, was there any reasoning power? That is the one thing we are going to do to help the court. Apart from that, we are not going to take any kind of stand. That is a question which was asked one of the in the WhatsApp group. Any other questions?
Yeah, I think now Dr. Jagdish has joined, our president of the South Zone IPS. Sir, welcome, sir. Jagdish, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Hi.
Please.
Yes.
We welcome President of IPS South Zone, Dr. Jagdish, to the forum. Sir, can you speak a few words about the initiative, sir?
I'm extremely glad that we have taken up this program of training all the doctors across the country, especially where there is some deficiency in learning. This can act as a bridge. I wish all the students will make use of this, and they should keep giving us the feedback so that we can improve upon or topics of their choice. I wish Dr. Suresh Badama, Dr. Naveen and the team for having make this event possible. It's not a problem of organizing funds. It's organizing the program is an issue. I am extremely glad that Dr. Suresh, Dr. Mahesh, Dr. Naveen, all of you have made this program a possible one. So wish you all the best. I wish we will take our teaching to higher levels, and we will see that doctors will be benefited from this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Kapil Upadhyay, you have a question. Can you please ask?
Can you hear me? So what
Yes.
if an international person with a history of psychiatric illness is brought to us for fitness to stand trial? Foreign.
Sir,
If I understand, Kapil, if you understand the question is, if an international patient is brought to us for fitness to stand trial, is it right, Kapil?
Foreign national.
foreign national brought for capacity for fitness to stand trial? That is the question has been asked.
Yes.
It is the same, because wherever you are going to be there, if you are in Rome, you have to follow the Rome law. If a foreigner is brought here, for example, a Bangladesh patient comes to India and is in conflict with law and he has been brought here for assessment, we will follow the law of the land. Yeah. Suppose if I go to some other country, like I'm in Netherlands, I get into conflict with law, I have to follow the law of the land there, Netherlands. Similarly here, whatever the assessment, what we are going to do here will be the same even for the foreign patient. The only thing is we may have to find the language, what we call it as matching, which is very, very essential. Many a time we may not have, and the assessment becomes difficult, even within India also. Any other questions?
Thank you, all of you, for joining us today. Today we had about just over 100 participants participating in the discussion. Dr. Suresh, yes, sir.
Yeah, one more thing is we will be sharing the files on how to do assessment. NIMHANS Forensic Proforma we will be sharing, and also the slides what Dr. Naveen has been presented. We will be sharing that slide also for all of your benefit. Please do give feedback so that we can improve upon our what we call it as these forum. And please, our team is trying to reach you all through the mobile phones so that we can ask feedback, and also to do at least one what we call it as a trial run separately, individually, so that there will be no hiccups when we do the presentation. So please take our call. Our NIMHANS team, Mr. Gautam will be calling you, will be talking to you if they have any problem, and we will share you the phone number also. You can also call him and ask if you have any problem regarding logging in using mobile phone or using laptop. And thank you for joining for this meeting and giving NIMHANS an opportunity to share the experiences.
Thank you and bye.
Thank you, sir. And meet you next week with non-invasive brain stimulation classes from NIMHANS. Today's program was supported by an educational grant from Linux Laboratories, Chennai. Thank you, everybody.